Good morning. Welcome to the launch of our Art History Festival 2023. My name is Dr. Christina Bradstreet. I'm Head of Programmes here at the Association for Art History, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this talk, which is kicking off our UK-wide Art History Festival, which runs from today right through to this Sunday. The Art History Festival is all about celebrating and exploring art history, the study of art from the ancient world to the present day across the globe. So if you enjoy art, architecture and design, you're in the right place. This festival is for everyone who wants to deepen those interests. This is our third edition of the festival, and this year we've joined up with 52 partners, including museums and galleries across the UK, from Orkney to Penzance, who are holding a wealth of talks, tours, and conversations, workshops, and family events in person or online. And our theme this year is colour, inspiration, insight, imagination. So we'll be exploring the importance of colour, its language and symbolism, its expression of emotion, its use in social movements, and its scientific study through our events. So this morning's event is all about colour in design, and we're joined first today by Emile de Brugen, Assistant National Curator, Decorative Arts at the National Trust, and he'll be talking about the influence of East Asian luxury goods on British interior design from the 17th century onwards, and how we see those influences on wallpapers and other designs in National Trust collections. So Emile will talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'm really delighted to say that we're joined by Andy Greenall, Head of Design at Little Green, and he'll be talking about how Little Green has taken inspiration from original wallpapers in the National Trust collection to create a fresh and modern take on heritage designs. And we'll then have time for questions, which will take us up to about midday. Please do write your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, as you think of them, as that will really help me to prepare. Just a quick few words on logistics. I expect you're all very familiar with Zoom by now, but you can switch on Zoom's automatic captions, audio captions, by clicking the captions button at the bottom of your screen. You may need to press the three little dots where it says more to find them. And you can also make the speaker's presentation bigger or smaller in relation to the image of the speaker themselves by hovering your cursor over the screen and then dragging the vertical line that will appear to the left or the right. And then finally, we are recording the event today, but rest assured we're not recording you. So I will hand over now to Emile de Brugen, Curator at the National Trust, for his talk today. Welcome, Emile.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Christina, and very happy to be here. You can hear me all right?
We can, and I'll just stay with you while you share your screen.
Yeah, that's right. I'll just open my presentation. We were practicing it a moment ago, but it seems to be a little bit different now. I can't immediately see the presentation that I was looking at a moment ago. So let's see what's going on. I'll just try again. I'm sorry about this. I can't immediately see where it's got to. It must be there somewhere.
Do you see a show all windows?
Yes, I'm looking in the window section, but I can only see the screen we're looking at the moment there. Let's see. Where else can I look?
You have still got it open, I presume, the PowerPoint.
I have got it open, yeah. I'm sorry about this. It worked a moment ago, but I'm sorry, it might be easier if you open it from your side. Would that be possible? I just can't see it here at the moment.
Rebecca, have you got any thoughts for us? While I find.
I'll just try closing it and then perhaps opening it again. Closing my presentation and opening it again. Maybe that will reset it. Okay, let's try again. Ah, yes, here we are. Okay, I'll just make it full screen.
Perfect,
So
thank you.
can you see that all right?
We can, thank you.
Great, okay. So
you've just come off the full screen, so you need
oh,
to
I'm sorry. Okay. Right. Right. Well, yes. This talk is about the impact of China and Japan on historic interiors in the British Isles, and it comes out of my research into the Chinese and Japanese collections of the National Trust, which are rich and varied, but previously haven't been researched very much. And it's fascinating to see how from the early 17th century, there's this influx of Chinese and Japanese luxury goods into the British Isles. And on the one hand, people were very much impressed by the material sophistication of porcelain and lacquer and woven silk. But equally, there was a perception at the time that China and Japan were very advanced civilizations, stable societies with long histories and highly developed cultures, educated people, very prosperous. And in 17th century Europe, which was, divided and lots of religious strife and wars and so on, these societies seemed very attractive and very admirable. So you get this mutually reinforcing admiration for East Asian material goods and East Asian excellence generally. So, for instance, porcelain plates like this one, which is at Dunamassy in Cheshire, were being imported into Britain in the early 17th century, about 1600, and they're known as craque, where probably after the Portuguese type of ship, which had already been importing this kind of porcelain to Europe for a number of decades. And those ships were called caraca, and that's probably where the Dutch made that into the word craque, and so that's what this ware is called. Motifs and taken, for instance, from Chinese painting, as you can see in the center, but equally Chinese symbolic motifs around the edges. But this type of porcelain was made specifically for Europe, initially for the Portuguese, and then for the Spanish, and then also for the English and Dutch, who began trading with China around about 1600. So already you see this interesting interaction between Chinese production, Chinese motifs, European demand, and the products being slightly changed in the process. And this is something that will happen again and again over the next few centuries. Also in the late 16th century, the 1590s, Chinese woven silk started to come to Britain in substantial quantities. This is at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, and this was a cushion cover that was upholstered with Chinese silk damask, and you can see the patterns of lotus in there. Amazing to think that that was there in the 1590s already. But also lacquer was coming to Northern Europe. This is a Japanese lacquer chest at Belton House, but like the blue and white porcelain plate, it's already a kind of hybrid East-West object. When the Portuguese started to trade with Japan, they were also at the same time trading with Gujarat in northwestern India, and they were very enamored of the mother of pearl inlay that was being produced in Gujarat. So when they saw that the Japanese could also do mother of pearl inlay, they asked them to produce things in a kind of pseudo Gujarati style, so very dense, very busy and complicated decoration. And this is an example of that style. The Japanese amusingly called this style Namban, which in Japanese means southern barbarian, because the Portuguese arrived in Japan from the south with their ships. So this was, to the Japanese, this was southern barbarian lacquer. Also, the shape actually is not Japanese, it's a European coffer shape, and you can still see in the way the decoration is arranged, you can see the echo of the wooden, sorry, the metal reinforcing straps that a European chest would have. So again, a very hybrid object. Also, porcelain was coming to Europe from China, in particular in the early 17th century. These are various types of porcelain that were coming from China in the 1640s and 50s, both blue and white, as you can see in the center, and enameled wares, as you can see on either sides. Amazing objects and materials to Europeans who couldn't produce this kind of porcelain yet at all. So kind of almost miraculous objects. At the same time, the Europeans wouldn't really have understood the meaning of the symbolism, for instance, the dragon on the left and the kind of narrative scene on the blue and white jar in vase in the middle, and the meaning of the flowers on the vase on the right. So it was a mixture of admiration, but also of incomprehension. And this is another feature of the European fascination with Asia. Also from India, chintz was being commissioned for the European market. And here you can see how all the motifs and styles were being combined. So on the one hand, you have Indian elements, but you also have the Chinese language of birds and flowers being used and being adapted. And you also have the influence of European embroidery and textiles as well. So all of these are being mixed together to create these chintzes, which were again very much admired in Europe in the 17th century because of their bright colors, and the colors were relatively permanent. They didn't wash away very easily. So this was a very popular product in 17th century Europe, but again, extremely hybrid. By the late 17th century, a different type of lacquer was coming from Japan, slightly more pictorial, as you can see here, this cabinet at Petworth in West Sussex. So we've moved from the Namban style to a more pictorial style, which was more to the taste of the Northern Europeans, like the British and the Dutch. At the same time, to a Japanese lacquer artisan, this landscape scene would have seemed very Chinese. This is done in a deliberately, what to the Japanese would have been a Chinese landscape style. So that's an interesting layer. But equally, the shape of the cabinet, again, is very European, because these types of cabinets based on Portuguese examples from the previous century. So, so very Japanese and very European at the same time, and also Chinese, actually. Lacquer was, at that point in Europe, was being rather brutally taken apart quite often, and used almost as a kind of wallpaper. And this taste started in Holland in the mid 17th century. This is an example that survives in the Netherlands from the 1690s, and you can see how Chinese lacquer screens have been taken apart and used to panel the walls of this cabinet. So it's a wonderful example of, on the one hand, the great admiration in Europe for East Asian materials and decorative art, and on the other hand, the complete lack of any idea of cultural authenticity. You could just take it apart if you wanted and use it in whatever way was appropriate for the Western consumer. A really interesting contrast. This kind of decoration was then replicated, for instance, in tapestries, in European tapestries. This is by John van der Bank the Elder, a London tapestry maker, who created these tapestries for Belton House in the 1690s. On the one hand, they try to replicate the look of Chinese lacquer. Originally, the background would have been darker. But at the same time, Van der Bank was also copying European book illustrations, European books about China and Japan. So it's interesting that even though he would have had access to genuine Chinese and Japanese lacquer, he actually chose to use a European interpretation of Chinese scenery and Japanese scenery as his models. So that's a really interesting cultural mechanism, that you choose fiction rather than reality. This was also being done in painted paneling. This is in the V&A by Robert Robinson from the 1690s. Again, very fantastical, completely transforming Asian imagery, creating a sort of European fantasy. You can see the very tall pagoda there in the middle. And images from European book illustrations of China were also making their way onto glazed earthenware. This is a Delft plaque, a little picture made of glazed earthenware, reproducing an image from a contemporary book about China. But of course, they were also using the blue and white color scheme deliberately as a reference to China, Chinese porcelain. And these are other Delftware pieces at Kingston Lacey. And here the Delft potters are deliberately copying Chinese porcelain, the narrative scenery on Chinese porcelain and the shapes of Chinese porcelain, but completely made in the Netherlands, in this case, also very popular in England at that time. So the mechanism of copying Asian art. And this is the kind of effect that Chinese porcelain would have in a grand interior in the 1690s. This is Petworth, West Sussex, and you can see these huge blue and white Chinese porcelain vases on European Baroque pedestals, and you can see the lacquer cabinet there. So this was how these different elements were combined and incorporated into a European Baroque framework. This is also both an example of taking things apart and changing the context. This is Chinese incised lacquer, Kwansai lacquer, where the designs were engraved and then the engraved areas were filled with pigments. But the original object was taken apart and reshaped into this coffer. You can still see here and there that it doesn't quite match, and so clearly another example of taking apart and reusing, obviously admiring the material but completely changing it in the process. At the same time, also wallpaper was starting to be produced in England. This is an English wallpaper from around 1700. And you can clearly see the echo of Asian lacquer, black background, the bird and flower scenery, but equally there's an echo of Indian chintz, sort of meandering vines and the different flowers on the same stem. So you can see how the Asian visual material is being absorbed and used by English artisans. And this was also happening with this kind of textile material, crewel work, which was produced in England in the 17th and 18th centuries, embroidered linen, again borrowing clearly from chintz, but also from Chinese decoration. But the Chinese themselves were also producing embroidered silk. This is a bed at Cork Abbey hung with embroidered silk around 1715. Again, you can see the influences from chintz, interestingly, chintz also influencing Chinese decorative art, and at the same time Chinese hunting scenes in there as well. And this is from about the same time, a English bureau cabinet made in imitation of lacquer, so very much a European Baroque type of furniture, early 18th century English type of furniture, but decorated by the English artisans with English lacquer imitating Chinese and Japanese lacquer. Again, a combination of European shapes and pseudo-Asian decoration. And these two objects, porcelain vase at Dunamassy on the left and lacquer screen at Erddig on the right, both Chinese objects. And here you can see the influence that Chinese landscape imagery was having on British interiors. The long tradition of landscape painting in China being reproduced on objects like these. And it's interesting that in the 1690s, Sir William Temple, an English diplomat and writer, wrote an essay about gardens, and he actually praised Asian porcelain and lacquer for the asymmetrical, naturalistic landscape and garden imagery. And he said actually that we should use that sort of imagery in our gardens. So an interesting early example of ideas about what would develop into the English landscape garden. So some of the inspiration of that probably came from Asian sources. Here on the left, we have a lacquer screen at Osterley Park, and on the right, an English leather screen at Chalkett Park. And you can clearly see how the English leather artist is taking elements from Chinese lacquer and reproducing them in a completely different medium, painted and gilded leather. So they're both actually around about 1720, so the same time. So you can see the inspiration happening. Elsewhere in Europe, this was happening as well, of course, not in isolation in Britain alone. This example in Germany is really interesting because it's one of the ancestors of what would later become Chinese export wallpaper. Here in this pavilion in Munich, the Pagodenburg Pavilion, they used Chinese hanging scroll paintings of birds and flowers set into the paneling as a kind of wallpaper. So these hanging scrolls weren't made as wallpaper, but they were used as such in this German setting. So a really interesting example about 1720. We're also producing different types of porcelain at this time, known as famille rose. The large jar on the right is a famille rose porcelain jar using enamels, and the barber's bowl on the left is also decorated with painted enamel. And some of the enamel technology had actually come from Europe, been introduced in China in the early 18th century, adopted by Chinese artisans and refined. So then you get products such as these, which are then being shipped back to Europe. So an interesting sort of circular development. This is an example of also from the around about the same time, 1730s, and an English wallpaper, clearly trying to reproduce Chinese bird and flower elements, but produced in England. Interestingly, before we have Chinese export wallpaper, so the English imitation preceded the Chinese original in this case. The first sort of Chinese wallpaper schemes that we have from the 1740s are like this at Saltram in Devon, where Chinese pictures were being used as a collage. So again, the pictures wouldn't have been made as wallpaper, but they were used as such by English paper hangers in the 1740s. This is probably the first example we know of a purpose-made Chinese export wallpaper at Felbrick Hall, where this is actually woodblock printed, but the sheets, the long vertical sheets, do seem to have been made as wallpaper for the European market. You can see that at the sides and below, the English paper hanger, John Scrutton, we actually know his name, has cut and pasted various fragments to make the scheme cohere better. This wallpaper wasn't strictly speaking panoramic yet, but the paper hanger was trying to make it look more panoramic by cutting away the edges and adding in fragments. The owner of the house, William Wyndham, wrote a rather grumpy letter in 1752 complaining of the cost of getting this paper hanger from London, which is great because now we know exactly when it was hung in 1752. Other styles of Chinese wallpaper, export wallpaper were quickly developing, like landscapes, such as Harwood House, seen here from the 1760s. And these were fully hand-painted by this time and truly panoramic, continuing from one sheet to the next. On the continent too, you see different types of Chinese wall coverings. This is a picture of Countess Tessin in Sweden in her sitting room with a wall covering that's either painted Chinese painted paper or perhaps painted Chinese silk. It's difficult to tell, but it could be either. So a wonderful vignette of how it was used at that time. This was, let's see what time, this is 1762. Also, you were seeing Chinese painted mirrors. Again, a hybrid product. Europeans sent mirrors to China. The Chinese artists scraped part of the reflective surface off and painted scenery on the back. And then these products were shipped back to Europe. Lacquer was still being taken apart, as you can see in this commode attributed to Langlois at Powys Castle. The lacquer is completely taken out of context, so clearly at this it was purely appreciated for its visual impact, not for its real significance. There was also an increasing influence on British porcelain and other European porcelains as well. This is Chelsea plate from the around about 1760. And you can see the influence of lacquer, the golden red, but also the sort of European fantasy of Chinese people in the center there. So combining fantasy with borrowed Asian elements. Chinese wallpapers were by now completely hand-painted, as this example at Nostell Priory, hung in about 1771. And at the same time, you can continue to see the influence of Asian elements in English leather screens. This leather screen was decorated in the style of Chinese export wallpaper, and it actually has a date on it. It was made in 1767 at Greyfriars in Worcester. Thomas Chippendale, the English cabinet maker, was also part of this Chinese taste in furniture, and here he was creating a kind of imitation lacquer, but again in a very fantastical style, and a fantastical style that looked back to early 18th century English imitation lacquer. So it's historicist and it's fantastical and it's pretending to be Chinese at the same time. Very complicated. But Chippendale was also taking inspiration from Chinese porcelain, as you can see in this wardrobe at Blickling Hall, which is clearly inspired by Chinese porcelain items such as the stool on the right, which is at Dereham Park, with landscape scenes. Chinese wallpaper made in Guangzhou, Canton at this time was also evolving. Color started to be added to the backgrounds, probably in response to European interest in color. and so an interaction between European and Chinese taste. And this was, for instance, reflected in increased use of color in European porcelain, such as these Sèvres items from the National Trust's collections, where you can see exactly the same colors being used. Some of the Chinese wallpapers also came in the form of sets of pictures that could be pasted onto the walls by the English paper hangers, and this seems to have influenced the development of the print room phenomenon in Britain, where people started pasting collections of also European pictures and prints onto the walls of rooms. The late 18th century, Chinese wallpaper was innovating again, and they started adding things like jardinières and bird cages and baskets of flowers and balustrades to the scenery of the wallpaper. And also they began to introduce this grisaille effect, this very dramatic effect where part of the scenery was painted in shades of grey and brown, probably for purely decorative reasons. Really interesting style from the late 18th century. At the same time in England, the Chinese style was continuing as well, and this is an interesting example of an English-made chintz made in Staffordshire, made in Lancashire, and it was used at Castle Cool in Northern Ireland and used there in 1807. And similar sort of Chinese style fantasy scenery was used at the Sèvres porcelain manufactory in France. These are from the 1790s. Fantasy Chinese scenery, but also imitating the look of Japanese lacquer with gold on black. And here is another example of using Chinese decorative art for inspiration. On the right is a Chinese silver gilt tankard, or made by Chinese artisans probably in the early 18th century, perhaps Chinese artisans working in Java in Indonesia. The wallpaper on the left is clearly inspired by that kind of Chinese silver, but it was produced in Dublin by a wallpaper maker called Robert Dyas in the early 1800s and hung at Castle Cool in 1807. This little pavilion, which is now at Stowe in Buckinghamshire, was repainted in the 1820s in that sort of Regency Chinese style. And for instance, the panels in the middle are inspired by Chinese mirror paintings, but some of the other motifs come from a book by the architect William Chambers about Chinese architecture. So again, using genuine Chinese objects or Chinese objects made for Europe, but also using European book illustrations for inspiration. Chinese wallpaper was still innovating in the early 19th century. For the scenery, as you can see here at Penrhyn Castle in Gwynedd. And the real plants were also being brought over to Britain. This is Biddulph Grange in Staffordshire, where in the late 1850s this complex garden was created using real Asian plants, but also completely fantasy style of garden buildings inspired by the English willow pattern glazed earthenwares, which were a sort of English version of Chinese blue and white landscapes. So fantasy combined with reality. Japanese prints started to come to Europe from the mid-19th century and had a huge influence in various ways. This is just one example of a print by Keisai Eisen, originally made in the 1820s at Tatton Park on the right. And on the left, you can see some fashion designs by Madeleine Vionnet from the 1920s and 30s, inspired by some of the aspects of costume you can see in the Japanese print. This is a Walter Crane book illustration of the story of Aladdin from 1875. And this is the kind of Victorian fantasy image of the East in its vaguest, sort of most fantastical incarnation. And interestingly, Crane was quite a progressive person. Apparently, he was even anti-imperialist, but at the same time, you can see a lot of kind of stereotypes of the East in Crane's illustrations. So really revealing in that sense. And this kind of English porcelain made at the Royal Worcester factory, it was made around about the same time. And again, you can see a mixture of inspiration from, for instance, Chinese and Japanese lacquer, but completely transformed and put in this sort of shape that seems to also have echoes of metalwork. So very much a Victorian version. It's in the style of the designer Christopher Dresser. Asian objects were still being adapted for Western uses. This is a Chinese cloisonné enamel vase, which was adapted as an electric lamp at Cragside in Northumberland in the 1880s. At the same time, there was a kind of romantic rediscovery of Chinese blue and white porcelain as part of the aesthetic movement in Britain in the late 19th century, and blue and white was seen as extremely tasteful and sort of idealized at this time. So a really interesting reappropriation of a particular type of Asian material. This object is completely in the Chinese taste, but the Chinese taste was also becoming original Chinese taste was becoming more known in the West, partly because of imperialism, because of increasing Western interference in Chinese affairs, more Chinese taste objects circulating on international art markets. But interestingly, this object was made in Canton, probably for the Western market, but by now the Western market was aware of Chinese taste objects such as this, a single panel screen with reliefs made out of kingfisher feathers. This is at Greenway in Devon. Example of a Victorian wallpaper around about 1900, in some ways very traditional, looking back to 17th century imitation Asian design, but for the recreated for the Victorian age. And at the same time also a discovery of Chinese embroidery, but interestingly through Melilla and Spain, because these embroidered shawls first were initially exported from China to Manila in the Philippines, and then also brought to Spain. And from there, they became quite popular in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's an example of how a Chinese product was kind of reincarnating itself in different places and becoming fashionable in widely different places. This is a 1920s bathroom at Upton House, very modern and Art Deco, but at the same time it has echoes of Chinese style, the red lacquer, an important element there. So Chinese style as part of Art Deco. And in the same house you have this wonderful gramophone player, so in the shape of a late 17th century English imitation Chinese cabinet. So it's an extraordinary combination of different eras and tastes and technologies, and really a good example of how this taste worked. And that was the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emil. If you'd like to stop sharing, and then we'll move straight over to Andy for his talk. Hi, Andy. And Emil, if you switch your camera off and mute. Perfect, thank you. And thank you, Andy. I'll just stay with you again as you share your screen as well.
Sure thing. Thank you. I'll just need to go full screen to make sure that works. Is that looking okay?
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Christina, and to Emil. Fascinating stuff there. Really interesting to see all that sort of knowledge and expertise in such a small sort of soundbite of the influence of those Chinese and Asian design elements in our culture. So we'll look into some of those. You'll see some repeated information as we talk through these slides. But my name's Andy. I work as head of design at Little Green, and as such, I'd just like to reassure you that puts me in a very much a behind-the-scenes role. I'm absolutely not here to with any underlying commercial agenda. I'm really just interested in beautiful wallpapers and tasteful interior design. So hopefully the slides that we run through will give you a flavour of what we're doing and why, first and foremost. For those of you who don't know Little Green, we're a fairly small family-run business, probably better known for our paints, decorative paints, than our wallpapers. But it is for the last, I think it's 18 years, we've been producing a collection of, or an ever-increasing collection of wallpaper designs, really bringing new life into old patterns. And on that basis, that's what I'm talking about today. Candidly, our first motivation is to produce wallpapers that complement our paint colours and paint colours that can complement our wallpapers. It's really about trying to infuse a bit of confidence in interior designers and homeowners with the use of pattern and particularly colour, obviously. So that is obviously a big motivation for us, and something that a lot of other wallpaper manufacturers or wallpaper brands aren't really able to offer in quite the same way. There's just a little insight here into the kind of things that we start with and the kind of process that we go through, and then subsequently the kind of things we end up with. So this is a design from our most recent collection. Originally, the paper is from Newark Park. The image on the right, where you can just see my feet on the studio floor, is just some preparatory colour work. We wouldn't produce so many colourways of the same design, but we do a lot of work to sort of work through colours that really work and some that perhaps don't. And then our final shortlist is usually 4 to 8 colourways per design of wallpaper, which we compile them in a book, and we publish one collection a year. So we're not hugely prolific, but it's work that we feel is a natural complement to obviously our paint collection, and it allows us to talk quite freely about interior design, or more completely about interior design, than we can with just flat paint color. And also, being candid, wallpaper takes a much better photograph than just paint. But I would reiterate that although we're a manufacturer first and foremost, I suppose as a brand, we see ourselves sitting firmly in contemporary and premium interior design. That's sort of where we operate. So why, or what's the premise on which we do this work the way that we do it? And I think probably if there's one big takeaway from what Emil has been talking about, this idea that nothing is original. A lot of creative people are really set on their work being their work, and I think we, on the contrary, would really try and embrace the idea that actually nothing is original, and everything is a sort of a rework or a processing of ideas or things that have gone before. I'll illustrate it with particularly this design, which made it into our one of our recent collections, from Oxburgh Hall, which is probably one of the most fertile properties in the National Trust for our wallpaper research. They've got a wonderful archive there, where the team have taken upon themselves to locate and preserve a whole host of wallpapers. So it's been a fascinating resource for us. And one of the designs, you see this image on the right-hand side, it's been printed on paper, as I say, at the end of the 19th century. That's the sort of date. It's been on a conventional wallpaper press, and this isn't a hand-painted thing. But you can see in the style of the design what they've tried to do with this shadow effect on the line and the little dotted effect is actually recreating the kind of things that preceded it in the form of leather wall hangings. So whilst I'm here sitting in a seat and thinking about how far should I be allowed to rework some of these old patterns, probably the person who created this 140 years ago might have been thinking the same thing, in that they're not creating something new, they're really trying to copy and work up ideas that have gone before. And I think that's clearly very evident from everything that Emil has shown us in the evolution of pattern design and the influence of the East. Just jumping back over to this property, sorry, that's a mistake. That's not in Norfolk, that's in East Sussex, that's Bateman's. This is Rudyard Kipling's house in the breakfast room. It's not a terribly good image there, but there is actually a leather wall hanging which adorns sort of 3 or 4 of the walls in that room, which he bought with his wife when they moved in. On the left, this is an actual photograph of the detail of that leather wall hanging, and to the right is a wallpaper that we created based on that design. But again, it's not that we're completely obsessed with working in wallpaper only. We will take inspiration from different substrates and artifacts, and anywhere where we can find a little bit of inspiration. So I'm just going to hop back up because I threw in that because it was leather. But this design here with the little leaf and in the pattern was the original, and this is what one colorway that we took with it. We reinterpreted it, and color is actually probably the biggest single way that we can make something old feel quite new. Those original papers would have been made in one colorway. I'll skip back up to it. So we've got, 5 colors probably in here. By the time you include something on the ground, you've got the blue, this detailing. It wasn't something that then would have been produced in other colorways, and that is an advantage that we can do now. I suppose it's sort of the realities of commercial printing is that it makes sense to do it because we can justify the production runs of these rolls, but we don't make kilometers of wallpaper at a time. We might buy our wallpapers 150 or 200 rolls at a time, something like that. Of that particular design, these are other colorways that we made available, so you can buy these. I've thrown in this slide because it's quite interesting to see how much the color can affect the way the design looks, or perhaps the way that you might use that design in a room. So these top few perhaps and the neutral paper on the right hand side being more tonal, they're sort of color on color, and you could use those in a sort of confident way along with tonal paint colors in such a way that the wallpaper adds a bit of flavor or a bit of depth, an extra layer to your interior design scheme, but without really contributing in a bold way to the overall feel of the color scheme. Whereas something like the paper on the bottom left is perhaps a bit more of a sort of statement wallpaper, should we say. It's not one of my favorite words, but that's the sort of thing that you might use in a slightly different way. It's not a backdrop that will go unnoticed. It's more the centerpiece of the room. This is, to be honest, this is a bit of, I'm paraphrasing Jean-Luc Godard, the film producer, but where it's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. That is something that I think is an important consideration in the way that we think about design in general, wallpaper design in the context of this work that we're doing. It's really interesting to sort of think about the evolution of these designs, and I'll show you in a minute some slides that illustrate how much we may or may not need to change the design in order to sort of contemporize them and make them relevant for the everyday sort of contemporary homeowner. But I think also it's really nice that in our relationship with the National Trust, and this is their sort of buzzword, their slogan, National Trust is something that's forever for everyone. And I think in some ways the story of wallpaper is summed up a little bit like that, in the way that it started out as something that really was for the elite and has become more recently, or since the advent of, I suppose, mass production, it became something that can be for everyone. So I'll talk a little bit about how we find these designs and what that process entails. But yes, I would say as we do exactly the same process for our paint colors. So our color card, we have in the region of about 200 sort of published colors on a color card that you can pick up at a local paint shop or order online. And a good chunk of those are sort of authentic historic colors, which are the product of research that we've done. This photograph actually is one of our research team using what's called a spectrophotometer. So this is a piece of kit that reads and records color, irrespective of the sort of lighting conditions that you're in, because you have to remember that some of the places we go to recruit these things, these colors and patterns are, not blessed with good natural daylight in the way that that's how you would probably choose your paint colors or your clothes in a shop. So yeah, this bit of kit allows us to faithfully recreate historic colors from the past. And honestly, some of, or probably most of, our best-selling paint colors are the old ones, are colors that have some sort of historical provenance. And I don't know if that's one feeding the other. I don't know if it's because they're historical that they sell better, or they sell better because they're historical and they've got something about them that is that sort of timeless quality that really works. And I think probably timelessness is a good word in our vocabulary of sort of little green design. That's something that we're aiming towards. So in terms of the process, I mean, our first stop in researching wallpapers is probably the National Trust's online collections database, which is a phenomenal resource. Anybody can access it. You just go on the website and you can look through and you can find stuff by searching keywords. And there's a lot of artifacts that have been catalogued, some with more background story than others. But it's a good starting point for us, and usually that gives us a pointer as to which properties or property we might target to go and have a look at. And then it's a case of securing some permissions and finding the right people on site to let us in and have a rummage around and get to the places that the general public sometimes can't see. These are just photos off my phone from walking around, but you can kind of see that there are areas that haven't perhaps had the attention from the conservation team that the front of house would have had perhaps, and ironically, I suppose for us, that makes them all the more interesting spaces that we're finding stuff that hasn't been seen. And this is typical of the kind of things that we're looking for. Actually, none of what you're looking at here are papers that yet have made it into one of the little green collections, but the process is an ongoing one. We research where we can, and we sit on some designs for as long as it takes. As I said, we only produce one wallpaper book a year, and that's probably 7, 8, maybe 9 different designs in a handful of colorways each one. So as I said, it's not that we're chugging through lots and lots of this sort of stuff. We can be quite selective about what makes it into a book. And we also have the advantage of not being too tied to, not chronologically tied. So we're not doing a book of wallpapers specifically from the 18th century or from the 20th century. We're quite motivated by how these things come together in a beautiful way, in a relaxed way, regardless of their origins. You can see here there's probably three papers on this bit of timber boarding here. That's quite typical of the way wallpapers are found. And on research projects, probably going back a good 15 years, we've retrieved papers that came off walls where the papers are actually, I think the biggest one was something like 17 or 19 layers of wallpaper thick, and we reproduced sort of layers 8 and 15 or something. Those are obviously like gold dust to conservation teams when they can get that information and do the work to separate the layers. And of course, what a beautiful sort of catalogue of wallpaper through the ages you get, because there's no way that they haven't been hung sequentially or chronologically. Each one is older than the last, and that really helps with dating those things, those elements of the room. This paper on the right is one from Oxburgh Hall in the sort of archive room that they've got there. Beautiful. It's absolutely stunning thing in real life. A gold ground with this beautifully block printed rose and trellis design. Really special. And when you find something like that, you're in a bit of a sort of a pinch me, is it real? Equally, I think I'm right in saying this was at Attingham Park, but sometimes, as I said, it's a case of finding the right member of staff on the day who's got the right set of keys to the right drawer. But these were locked away, these painted panels, rolled up. This is one of about 4 or 5, I think, rolled up and just stored in a drawer, locked away. And the curator who was there on the day knew about them, but seemingly no one else did. So that was a real hit. And Emil, well, I'm sure you're aware of those. If you're not, so there you go, Attingham Park. And Emil, the design on the right-hand side, you will have clocked in Emil's presentation, this peacock. And that photograph on the right is actually that wallpaper in that colorway on the wall in the sort of entrance vestibule to one of the bedrooms upstairs. Oops. I put it in as an example of a paper that doesn't really require any work. Our contemporary interpretations of that have just been to redraw it, so that you can see a couple of colorways there, and again you can understand how the color affects what you might do with it, or where you might use it. Another way that we might mess around with, that sounds a bit disrespectful, I don't mean mess around, I mean to sort of reinterpret an original design. Scale is obviously something that we can do something with. Now this piece is a border, so probably only 20 or 30 centimeters, 8 or 12 inches in height for the original. We sort of factored it up by 10 and created a sort of a paper that grows from below. So this does not repeat going up the wall. This is like a mural or a panel design, which I'll come back round to, because it's an interesting sort of full circle almost to the way that the original scenic wallpapers were made, in that they also weren't repeating patterns. The whole idea of a repeating pattern came out of the ability to make money by mass producing pattern in a machine. And then sort of the other extreme, a bit more creative license, we might take some little elements. So this little pair of birds on a leaf was a hand painted element that we found on this less interesting stripe wallpaper. Again, this was in the cupboard at Felbrigg. And our interpretation of that, as I said, we've taken a slightly looser approach and done a bit more work to create something that acknowledges those historical elements and the hand of the artist of the original, but has a place in contemporary interior design. And then, don't worry, Christina, I haven't got third, fourth or fifth principles. Second principles, all ages are welcome, and in the inclusive way that sounds, I'm really referring to this notion that we'll take inspiration from papers or artifacts regardless of their age, and we'll work with them in combination regardless of their age. So yeah, our source material covers about 500 years. Montacute House in Somerset, again, it's not a great image, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle on the right, but actually that's a very important and significant piece for the trust. It's a tapestry that recently has been refurbished, I think within the last 18 months, and it's back on display now. So if you're anywhere near there, check it out, because it's quite an impressive thing, and I believe it's one of the oldest sort of decorative artifacts of its kind, at least in the trust's care. These floral elements in the background, sort of in design terms, are referred to as a millefleur, but it being a tapestry, we actually try to recreate the effect of it looking like a tapestry, if you like, in the design of it. So we've maintained the sort of needlework in the detail of this pattern. And we've obviously breathed a bit more life into it, in terms of, or breathed a bit more space into it. It's not quite the sort of congested thing that you can see here. And that, again, is a different colorway of the same design, but that's probably our earliest sort of piece of reference material for anything that we've worked with. If we skip forward a few hundred years, we're into the 19th century here. William Burgess was an architect who worked on this property Nightshades down in Devon, and he took it upon himself to also have a big hand in the sort of Gothic interiors, and this snail wallpaper, which is, I think, on the bathroom wall, but it is one you can see there now. That's another one that we've taken, and again, didn't have to do too much with, but we've been able to have some fun with the colours. There are more colours of that available. The point that I wanted to make with this design is that we use a technique called surface print, which is probably our favourite method of printing wallpapers, and it's the sort of the modern way to recreate an old-fashioned wood print or block print, but the design are printed on rollers, and as I say, it's a modern interpretation. The machine that this is printed on, so that's not that particular design, but this is the machine that is used to print that wallpaper. It'll do 9 surface colors on the same production run before it sort of spits out the other end and with dried ink. And this has been running since 1838. So I use modern as a slightly sort of inaccurate description of the way this is made, because that's probably is the most reliable machine in the wallpaper factory as well. Bill, that being said, this image on the right, actually that paper coming off there is the scrolled yellow paper that I showed you right at the beginning. And one of the features here of the block printing press is this really lovely painterly effect that it leaves on the paper. You can't quite see it on the close-up on the left, but hopefully the thing on the right, that's actually just a sort of an extreme close-up of block printed or surface printed wallpaper. And you get, it's almost like a tactile quality. It leaves a bit of texture behind, and you get this process of, it's called reticulation. There's the roller leaves the paper, you get this sort of seaweed effect that gets left in the paper, and it's a beautiful, very authentic way to produce a lot of these older designs. You get this lovely sort of chalky finish and very opaque color. So that's a real sort of hit and a feature of our papers that we're really proud of. It doesn't, not all our papers are surface printed, but a lot of them are. This one will come around in a minute. Is a more contemporary design, found at Oxford again, but probably not necessarily used on the walls. But it's from the 1950s, and we've printed that by a process called Surflex. So some of the colours are printed in with a surface printing machine, and others with a flexographic colour application, which is a slightly different thing. And then in my time traveling way, I've gone non-chronological here because I'm going back. Emil has mentioned the Chinese wallpapers. Belton House in Lincolnshire is one where we turned up and we spent, I think it actually ended up being 2 days just to photograph all the elements of this before recreating our own interpretation of this design. And my point being that in this way of working full circle, the most modern way of printing wallpapers is on a digital printing machine. So if you imagine an office printer, but 20 times bigger and wider and longer, and it's able to feed enormous long rolls of wallpaper through it, but it prints it line by line. And what it does enable you to do is have a non-repeating pattern. And that really is what become very relevant for our work, where we're looking at these early, particularly the scenic designs, where they were originally put on the wall by artists, craftspeople, or in the case of the one at Felbrigg, painted in China and exported and then hung by an English specialist. but then they're not repeating patterns, and therefore we're able to sort of embrace the authenticity of the original and the creativity that brings. Actually, it's really interesting working in the world of wallpaper design, because printing digitally really has changed everything in terms of what we're able to do. So that's been something that's come about in the last few years, and we'll see more and more of. But yeah, a very interesting way to complete the circle, if you like. Another different colorway of the same. And I think that brings me to about close, hopefully about right on time. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Andy. So if you would like to stop sharing, and then we'll bring back Emil. And we've got some questions for you, and we'll probably run over just by a few minutes, just to take a few questions, if that's okay. So thank you so much for your presentations and for kicking off this festival for us. It's been such an interesting start for us. So there was a great question from Morag, I thought. So she asked to what extent the tapestries that mimic the lacquer work faded. She says the London tapestries are obviously very dulled down now, but in contrast to the Delfton porcelain, which doesn't fade, how much brighter were the tapestries to start with from the 17th century?
Yes, that's an important point, and they would have been much more saturated because the backgrounds of them were meant to look like lacquer, so either very dark brown or black, whereas now they're sort of beige. And the colors too of the scenery would have been much brighter, yes, reflecting the colors seen in lacquer and porcelain, so bright greens and bright reds and yellows and so on. So I think in the case of those tapestries, it's there are other examples elsewhere which have a bit more of their color in them. So yeah, and also you see it in some Chinese wallpapers as well, that they've faded, and originally they would have been much brighter, in a way sometimes slightly shocking, you know, that we sort of think the faded colors are kind of tasteful and associated with old houses and everything, but originally often they would have been much more saturated. So it's sort of sometimes the past, the taste of the past might be what we call sort of shocking taste today, but that's the interesting thing about it.
And so Morag's question then made me think about whether there's a broader question about whether there was an issue around kind of faded colours of antiquities muting the colours of the subsequent modern British interior design, or whether it's all about the kind of East Asian art bringing in a taste for very bright, rich colours, or maybe it's both.
I think that definitely East Asian luxury goods helped to introduce more color into European interiors. You know, for instance, the blue and white porcelain, you know, the colors were so intense, and that then was copied by European glazed earthenware, but also and also the intense colors on Chinese wallpaper. Interestingly, in the later 18th century, you see that European costume as well becomes more colorful, sort of bright reds and blues and greens. So yes, I definitely think that there was that effect. It's sometimes difficult to quantify, but I think generally, yes, there was that effect.
And Jan was asking, was there a lot of communication between the Western European clients and Chinese wallpaper makers? So might the clients say, for example, we're particularly interested in these colours or these particular colourful scenes or motifs? And was there much desire for an authenticity?
We kind of have to infer what the conversations were, because we don't have a lot of direct evidence of, for instance, European merchants talking to Chinese producers, but you do see that Chinese producers seem to be responding to European trends by introducing new colors, new elements. So there was most likely some kind of dialogue going on, which we kind of have to reconstruct from the surviving objects. And sorry, what was your second part of your question?
Was the authenticity important, or was it just about kind of finding out what sells, I suppose?
Authenticity is a fascinating subject because in the 17th century, for instance, the idea of authenticity just seems to be absent. People didn't really seem to worry about authenticity. They loved Asian things, but they used them in a completely different European way, and they didn't seem to be bothered by that. Whereas in the late 19th century, you start to see much more interest in what is genuinely Chinese, what is genuinely Japanese. You start to see Japanese gardens being recreated exactly in Britain. So there is that development from the 17th to the 19th, 20th century that authenticity becomes more and more important. Probably something to do with the Romantic movement, the emphasis on essences, the essence of the self, the essence of a culture. That probably made authenticity much more important. But that's also interesting in relation to what Andy was showing us, how you, Andy, and your colleagues are taking something and changing it, but also preserving the original sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the color, historically bright colors, and it was about an expression of wealth. I think it's fair to say, and sort of it was more important to express your wealth probably than to show that you had great taste. That might be argued. I think a lot of we see similar designs in the National Trust property portfolio. There's a Chinese bedroom at Belton. There's a Chinese bedroom at Belbriggan. Actually, the way that the owners of those properties would communicate, and a bit of one-upmanship between the two of them. And you must come round to see my the wallpaper that I just imported from China. There was a lot of status games involved, I think. I'm right in saying. And I mean, it's no secret now that it's more expensive to produce, even in paint. It's more expensive for little green. We don't charge you more for a really bright red, but actually it costs us more money to make a tin of bright red paint than it does a tin of white paint, because it's more, the pigment is the expensive bit, and certainly in a formulation like ours, you do use a lot of pigment. So I think, yeah, it's interesting sort of development really, from sort of an expression of wealth through to taste. There's a colour story in there too.
There's another very interesting question here from Morag for you, Andy. She says, as there's presently a lot of concern and sometimes outrage even about cultural appropriation, how much is this a consideration when you're choosing what to reproduce?
Well, as I suppose it's an inevitable thing that when we're looking at source material from the past, our arms are spread quite wide in terms of what we're gathering, and there are things that we're looking at that influence what we do, that have cultural significance, whether it's good or bad. And I think the Trust and ourselves as Little Green are very sensitive to issues of cultural appropriation. Our motivation is solely to create beautiful things. That's really sort of my remit and the focus of what we do. But we can't pretend that there's not a backstory behind some of these things, and that's something that we in the Trust negotiate on, or talk about on an ongoing basis all the time.
It sounds like such a dream job, being able to go into the archives, and do you work very closely with the curators? Is it kind of important to learn a lot about the kind of the history and the art?
It is. Sometimes, as I said in the thing, sometimes it depends who's there on the day, what sort of information you're going to get. And it might be the case that there's somebody who wasn't available on the day that we were there that we then need to speak to ensure that we've got as complete a story as we can have in order to write about that design and where it's come from. So it's real credit to the trust that all this information is there, but it's also really important to sort of understand, who you need to speak to or who's got the keys to which door in order to sort of make that the most fulfilling experience or mission that you can have. But yeah, they're the real highlights of the job. There's some rubbish bits with every job, but they're real highlights.
Rebecca was asking how much hand painting or drawing do Little Green do, or is it all computer based?
Almost everything starts hand painted, or we work from photographs if they're very good and we don't need to do too much with the design. But in the case of the sort of Chinese influence panels, I was saying to Emil before we came on that the bedroom at Feldrig is one that we've been working on for quite a long time, and we were hoping to get it into the collection that we're going to be launching in January. And we've had to let it go. It's going to go in a later book. We're going to have to revisit it with more resources because we're just not quite happy that we've done it justice in our reinterpretation. So there can be a lot of work, and actually taking every element back to being hand painted is sometimes what you have to do. Sometimes it's not necessary if the design is able to be transferred into files that we can then use to separate out for the different color separations. But we do use wallpaper artists or fine artists even to do some of that work for us. Yeah.
And also, you spoke a lot about the influence of wallpapers on your wallpaper design, but do you ever take influence from, for example, from Chinese ceramics or other decorative art items?
I would say less so, obviously, but it's not a collaboration and trust that's anywhere near exhausted, and we're very interested in the way that these ideas and the project sort of evolve, and I there's an inevitability, I think, that we will be looking at more artifacts and a broader sort of range of source material than just wallpaper. I mean, probably we're wallpaper, wall hangings and fabrics is about where we're up to at the moment. But I mean, certainly having seen some of the stuff on Emil's presentation, I was furiously writing a few notes on there and taking photographs of my screen of things I'm going to ask about afterwards, because I think there's some interesting stuff that will be good ingredients for us a bit further down the line.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we should probably draw to a close, but one final question for Emil from another Emil. He says, do you know when historical wallpapers are restored normally, would installers, so when they're restored, would you use Chinese pigments to do it? Sorry, this is not, I'm getting slightly unclear here. Would you use Chinese pigments to do it, even mineral pigments, as they're so expensive? So would you use the original kind of Chinese pigments, I think is the question.
Yes, that's an interesting area as well. And there are actually different schools of thought among paper conservators, and some use more Asian methods to conserve Chinese wallpapers, and some use more European methods. Both can be effective. So it also depends a little bit on the situation. But yes, that's another fascinating aspect, and often the wallpapers then get taken off the walls really carefully and looked at and consolidated, sometimes with new backing underneath, and indeed in those cases sometimes Asian paper can be the most appropriate, and then sometimes the losses are painted back in and things like that. So that's a very complex but very rewarding process. So and an ongoing one. So yeah, so the short answer is both methods can be used.
Well, thank you both so much for your talks today. And I love the idea that Emil's presentation may have inspired future little green designs, which will then probably appear on my in-laws' living room wall. So thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through them all, but I hope you will stay with the festival. This is just the beginning today. If you're free this evening, we have a talk about the Black British abstract painter Frank Bowling, and we'll be hearing from his son and studio manager Ben Bowling, and we'll be joined by curator Eleanor Cripper, who'll be talking with Ben about his father's work. But there are many more events for the festival, as I said, nationwide. There's likely an event at an art gallery near you, so do check out our festival program. There are also 15 other online events as well coming up if you can't get out and about this week. So you can find the festival program at our website, forarthistory.org.uk, and you can follow us on social media at forarthistory, and I'll put that in the chat in just a moment as well. So do stay with the festival this week, and I hope you enjoy talks. And thank you again to Emil and Andy for your fascinating, really interesting talks. We have really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. So see you all again soon. Thank you.